Good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and with me today is John Collorafi. John, how are we doing?
Happy to be with you, Craig.
Well, it's great to have you here to continue the series of history of the Papacy. We've finally made it to the 5th century. Now, I'll start the same spiel as I start with all these, that it's important for people to keep in mind when talking about the history of the papacy. The Bishop of Rome over the centuries was the single most important bishop on earth. This is the history of the papacy, as I said. Though the term papacy is an anachronism, we will use this term due to its popular acceptance. By God's grace, we'll undergo an unprecedented presentation on this subject. Never has the history of this institution been covered from its origins up until a century before the Great Schism in a methodical, well-rounded way. There's both an Orthodox and Catholic lay expert, well-read in the primary sources, whose task will be to make available to the listener the content necessary to become informed on the subject. The hope is that this will create a fair and balanced overall presentation which will leave the viewer more informed on the subject matter than he or she would be otherwise hearing just one side in isolation. Though the presenters will strive for impartiality, the listener should expect that the Orthodox and Catholic sides will have very different presuppositions which will color their presentations. The Orthodox side will probably presume upon the papacy corresponding to Orthodox canonical norms, which, despite elements of headship exercised by the Pope, such as the capacity to hear appeals, subjugates the Bishop of Rome to a conciliar system which has final say. The Catholic side will probably presume upon the papacy corresponding to Catholic canon law, which asserts the Pope has supreme, immediate, and universal ordinary power and dogmatic infallibility. One should strive for transparency when inferences made from the historical evidence are colored by such presuppositions. Each century of church history will be covered in a singular episode up until the 9th century. 4 or 5 different topics per century are covered. The goal has been for each side to talk to 5 to 7 minutes. Today we were already talking they would do about 10 minutes. We're on our system. The idea is to cover as much content in a succinct manner without being loquacious. The Orthodox Catholic side will alternate who presents first, so no side has the last word each time. After all the topics are presented, each speaker will be given 5 minutes to offer closing thoughts on the century. There will be no live question and answers to reduce showtime. Please like the video, share it, and leave questions so we can respond to them in writing or in future question and answer episodes. And so I just want to let people know, please share these because people keep arguing these things about the papacy that John and I have already covered. So take advantage of this resource, make it available to others. In today's episode of the 5th century, we're going to be covering the Council of Carthage in 419 and the events immediately leading up to it. We'll be covering the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon, and then the Acacian Schism. And because I went first last time, John, if you would like, we could start with the Council of Carthage. And it'll be with you.
That'll be fine. I just want to say before we start, you've had some kind words for me on your channel in the past, so I think it's a sign that you have a character that leans towards magnanimity, and I think that's deserving of praise. And the listener should not expect a debate with formal argumentation. If you want that, you have Brother Peter Diamond. I hear he's really good at it. Here we analyze and give a synopsis of the patristics. If I give argumentation, it will be from the fathers of the church and the popes, and I will try to reproduce their argumentation as faithful as I can. I'm going to try to avoid argumentation of my own making, although there is room for interpretation. I'll reserve that right if there is a major misinterpretation of the historical sources that urgently needs correction. So with that, I'm ready to start if it's okay with you, Craig.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so Council of Carthage. Now, 17, there was a general council of the bishops of Africa. And one of the canons, Canon 17, prohibits the priests and deacons and lower clergy from appealing to Rome. Why? Why did this happen? Well, Tefila, the council historian, believed, and I tend to agree, that it was a reaction to an appeal of a priest named Apiarius, which is kind of an appeal gone bad. We'll see why that is. So our source is the record of the councils from what's known as the Vienna Corpus of the Latin Writers, volume 149, the abbreviation is CSEL. And it tells us that, letter from 419, Pope Zosimus had sent legates to Carthage. One of them was Faustinus, a bishop, also two priests, Philip and Asellus. Aurelius had held a council in 418. He was the primate of Carthage. The Roman legate, Faustinus, the bishop, had interrupted and basically asked that the council take up business enjoined on him by the Apostolic See, in other words, Rome. And they had to do with what he calls the canons of Nicaea. And under some questioning, the legate revealed his instructions, which had come from Rome. It had to do with appeals of bishops to Rome, excessive number of bishops traveling to see imperial officials, cases of priests or deacons unjustly excommunicated, be handled by neighboring bishops. And then there was this fourth point. A bishop named Urbanus of Sicca was going to be excommunicated or summoned to Rome if he did not amend a sentence against the priest Apiarius, whom he had condemned. Now, according to Pope Zosimus, the canon about appeals of bishops to Rome had been decreed in the Council of Nicaea. It was read out, and one of the bishops, Alypius, said that they had not found this canon in the canons of Nicaea. And then this got to be a little bit of a controversy. They started making inquiries, and it turns out that the appeal canon had been from the Council of Sardica. And this is not a huge mystery today, because when the popes quote the canons of Sardica in the 5th century, they will quote them as canons of Nicaea. It's technically not correct, but that's what their codices said. They'd read out a canon of Sardica, or rather, call it a canon of Nicaea, and the Africans are saying, well, where did this canon come from? So it turns out we're talking about Canon 17 of Sardica. If a bishop was moved by haste or bitterness to expel a priest or deacon, the cleric could appeal to neighboring bishops lest an innocent man be condemned. Now, the bishop said that the canons of Nicaea were agreeable to them. But what they did was they agreed to abide by this canon while they made an investigation about the canons of Nicaea. And they enacted a canon that allowed priests, deacons, and lower clergy to appeal not only to neighboring bishops, but to the primates of their provinces or to African councils. But clerics who appealed overseas were not to be received into communion by anybody in Africa. Now, Pope Zosimus died in late 418. His successor was named Boniface. So he had to continue to resolve this case of the priest Apiarius. An African council wrote to Boniface and said that this had been no light scandal about this priest, that he had been restored to communion, he had asked for forgiveness of his mistakes, Apiarius had not been allowed to function as a priest in his original diocese of Sika, but he had received letters authorizing to function anywhere else in Africa that he liked. So there's a sort of compromise there. Now, the bishops informed Pope Zosimus that yes, they were willing to observe these canons of Nicaea, which were really canons of Sardica, while they did an investigation about what the canons of Nicaea really said. So what happens? Well, we find out what happened with Apiarius by a letter up to Remus from an African council to the next pope, Celestin I. And the African bishops who wrote this letter are very unhappy with what happened. Apiarius basically broke down, he confessed his sins, which according to the African bishops were quite serious and shameful. And they were very unhappy because the priest was guilty, he'd abused his appeal rights, and it was his own bishop that had been threatened with condemnation under Pope Zosimus. So that's the basic context for this letter, the letter up to Remus. And so they write to the Pope and say, we beseech you, do not give a hearing so easily to those who come from here or in the future, receive into communion those excommunicated by us. And let your holiness, as is worthy of you, repulse also the infamous appeals of priests and other clergy, because this has not been derogated, in other words, taken away from the African Church by any definition of the fathers, and because the decrees of Nicaea plainly committed lower-ranking clergy and bishops themselves to their metropolitans. And then they add another final point. For that any should be sent as legates from the side of your holiness, latere in Latin, we have not found to be established in any synod of the fathers. And do not grant clerics as executors to any who ask for them, lest we appear to introduce the fumes of worldly pride into the light of the Church of Christ. As for our brother Faustinus, that was the legate, we are certain that given the rectitude and moderation of your holiness, Africa will suffer from him no longer. So, this is quite a rant, and they are, I think, really unhappy about what happened. Unhappy with the legate, the way he handled it, the abuse of the appeals process, and so on and so forth. Now, this is around the year 426 under Pope Celestin. Now, that's the last I hear of it. Notice, that's the last I hear of any kind of relations between Rome and Africa in the record until we get to Pope Leo, St. Leo I, about 22 decades later. So we don't really know how Rome immediately responded to that particular letter. However, Pope Leo's letter 12, Epistle 12, is about the situation in Africa. It's basically in the decretal mode, giving instructions, resolving cases. And in that letter, basically almost nothing has changed. He's still sending legates into Africa. He's actually complaining about the ordination of highly unsuitable men to the episcopate. Legates investigating that. We know from St. Leo's other letters that he still refers to the canons of Sardica as Nicene. We know from his response to the appeal of Flavian. We'll be talking about that. Only one thing that I see has really changed, and that is he does tell them that if any cases arise, investigate them there on the spot. Investigate them locally in Africa, and then send them over here to be resolved by us. Okay, so he understands that there can be abuses when the popes are pretty much intervening and micromanaging cases of lower clergy in Africa somewhere, and then trying to hear the appeal. He says, no, investigate those things over there, and then send these matters to us for a confirmation. That's in St. Leo, letter 12. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Craig. Go ahead.
Thank you, John. I will try not to repeat the content you already covered. So, guys, if you want more detail on my presentation, just rewind because John will cover a lot of stuff. Now, I think the context behind this Council of Carthage really starts with the Donatist controversy, because this would create a lot of appeals to Rome and Milan, and the Roman emperor specifically, who would generally cart the case off to a ecclesiastical court. And so Carthage 393 in their 27th canon, and then eventually Carthage in the 419 council in the 125th canon. These are Latin numbers, by the way. Disallowed for foreign appeals for local clergy. So, like, for example, Canon 125 says, "Let them not carry the appeal except to African councils or to the primates or to their provinces, but whoever shall think of carrying an appeal across the seas, he shall be admitted to communion by no one in Africa." So John mentioned that, and the reason I bring it up is the idea was to prevent appeals. Like the Synod of Data show, I think it's around the same time, around year 424 in the Sassanid Empire, did the same thing. They didn't want to have appeals go past their jurisdiction. There would have been past Antioch. So Africa did the same thing. They prevented appeals going to Rome and also to Milan and to wherever the Roman emperor was. Now, the Pelagian controversy created a lot of appeals, and during this, there was a Council of Carthage in 416 that condemned Pelagianism, and they wrote to Pope Innocent that the authority of the Apostolic See should also be added to the statutes of our lowliness, like we see in John's book, Keys, in page 142. This demonstrates the seeking a consensus on the issue, right? Like, they didn't want to settle in isolation. They also wanted to run it by the papacy, so that way the whole Western jurisdiction would be on the same page about Pelagianism. By the way, it's because Pelagius made his way from Rome, and he was originally from elsewhere, I think in the English Isles. So that being said, Pope Innocent responded approvingly that he ought to be referred to for his judgment. And he wrote, and this is on Keys, page 144, "All those who are set in this place, that's Rome, desire to follow the Apostle Peter, from whom the episcopate itself and the whole authority of this name is derived. And that whatever be done, even in distant provinces, not be concluded until it be brought to the knowledge of this see." So you can see Pope Innocent is speaking of provinces, which is contextually those within their own patriarchate. And he also uses this language of consensus similar to other papal letters, that he must consent to whatever is being decided in that jurisdiction. Now, I find interesting that the honorific concerning Rome's Petrine authority entails that all bishops are successors of Peter. I just bring this up because it's something that came up in an episode of the first century episode. Now, by 417, Rome has condemned Pelagianism twice, but it looked like Pope Zosimus had reneged on this. And so pretty much Carthage didn't appeal to another jurisdiction. They just simply appealed to the earlier Roman judgments to say, well, the sentence against Pelagius and Celestius, they remain. And you can see this in page 148. So Pope Zosimus responds to this, and this is page 151 of John's book. "Our authority is such that nobody may review our sentence." Now, I think these words are very important because this idea that no one can review Rome becomes an idea that evolves over time as we talk about the history. But without getting to that, as we can see here, interpatriarchal appeals cannot be above the patriarch, right? So Carthage didn't appeal elsewhere. They appealed to Rome's previous judgment as a way of nullifying Zosimus' current judgment, but Zosimus considered this review and rejects the permissibility of this. Now, neither of these positions disallows for interpatriarchal appeals, which Augustine explicitly writes in letter 43 are in fact able to overturn Roman synodical judgments. Now, African pressure evidently led to both the Eastern and Western Roman emperors to force Zosimus to revisit the issue, where he then condemned Pelagius, and Pelagius eventually and Celestine, they were done away with the Council of Ephesus. So that's what settled that. But during this time of friction, Zosimus had accepted Apiaris to communion, and that's what really creates this whole issue. Historians like Bernard Green think this is likely revenge for being overturned on Pelagius, that the strings were pulled with the Roman emperors. Well, whatever the real issue, as John covered, there's this debate over the canon that was cited by Zosimus and his legate that gave him the right to review things such as an appeal from Apiaris. And the African Council then appeals to Alexandria and Antioch and Constantinople for copies of the Nicene Council. And they say, all right, as John said, until we find out what the real deal is with maybe with other authentic copies of these canons, we will at least observe your judgment until that point. But look how they say they will observe it. They say, in no way could we be compelled either to endure such treatment as we are unwilling to mention or could suffer what is unbearable. So this you could see in Canon 134 of the Council of Carthage 419. So they wouldn't wait another cotton picking second unless the canons tell them that they must. So they obviously found it quite alien that the Pope could intervene in such an issue. Now, Canon 138 is even more harshly worded. It's actually wasn't from 419, it's from 424 in response to Pope Celestine. And they say, we earnestly conjure you, they're talking to the Pope, that for the future you do not readily admit to hearing persons coming hence, nor choose to receive to your communion those who have been excommunicated by us, whosoever thinks himself wronged by any judgment may appeal to the council of his province or even to a general council, that is, of Africa, unless it be imagined that God can inspire a single individual with justice and refuse it to innumerable multitude of bishops assembled in council. Just want to point that out because they're saying the Pope cannot overturn a council full of people, that God would inspire a single person in isolation. And that sounds kind of strange, but if we remember we talked about Nicaea in Century 4, they said we could see the Holy Spirit at work when there's consensus among so many bishops in so many places. So that's kind of the idea that they're drawing at. It only seems kind of bizarre, jarring, if we kind of read back into, well, isn't the Pope infallible or isn't the Pope supreme? But if that wasn't an idea at the time, what they're saying makes sense if they had this sort of Nicene view of the Spirit having his testimony seen in consensus of bishops. They continue, for that your holiness should send any on your part we can find ordained by no council of the fathers, who desires you to delegate any of your clergy to execute your orders, do not comply, lest it seem that we are introducing the pride of secular dominion to the Church of Christ. So in other words, they're telling Celestine that Epirus Appeal has appealed African judgment, and they order Celestine to desist. All right? This is an order, and they, on that note, leave the door open to appeals, but they think that if there's no consensus on this matter, this is sort of like the autocratic rule of an emperor, hence the reference to secular dominion. So, in conclusion, the Council 419 and Carthage, and then really the continuation of this Council 424, is a demonstration of consensus ecclesiology over against the Pope deciding in isolation. That's just what it is. All right, so now that we've covered the Council of Carthage, let's move forward to the Council of Ephesus. I will start, and then John will go after me. Long story short, Nestorius, the Bishop of Constantinople, was teaching adoptionism and threatening to use the Roman Emperor to impose his view on the entire church. We can see this in St. Cyril's first letter to Celestine, page 130, in Price's translation of Ephesus. It says, by using the authority of his see to scheme against all, he, Nestorius, will induce us and everyone else to adopt his beliefs. Induce us. Now, Nestorian sees authority is that of the Roman Emperor, not of a charism of Constantinopolitan primacy. No one's talking about that. It is taken for granted that the Roman Emperor can impose beliefs, right? He's got power. But the Pope is never described in this way at this time. That's something interesting we should note historically. Now, Cyril exhibited considerable patience in trying to get Nestorius to recant, but when he didn't, he got ready for war. Now, what war meant was finding allies and building a consensus against Nestorius, as the consent of the patriarchs was necessary to depose a patriarch, as we covered with Paul Samosata and St. Athanasius, that we need the consent of patriarchs to depose a patriarch. Now, Cyril's first letter to Celestine cajoles Celestine to support him by citing that, and I'm quoting, same page, all the bishops of the East, especially Macedonia, agree with him. Now, this is interesting because he says, we, right, as in him and Celestine, shall prompt them, the rest of the church that is, as they desire, because they must consent, to make a joint stand with one soul and one mind and to contend for the Orthodox faith. So, by citing universal support to Celestine, he's saying that Celestine's going to pick a winning side in this dispute, because there's consensus. Second, it's interesting that Thessalonica's or Illyricum support was not a given when they were under Roman jurisdiction. And this shows that Carthage 419 was not a one-off. Rome did not have supremacy even with their own local jurisdiction. There had to be consent, sort of like we read about Apostolic Canon 34. These canons weren't talking about random things. Now, Rome cooperates with Cyril's plan, but in their correspondence, papal statements are made which are more strongly worded than anything we've seen yet thus far in history. Right? So Celestine's letter to Nestorius states as follows, page 141. You have been totally expelled from the universal fellowship. I mean, that sounds pretty definitive. Celestine's letter to the clergy of Constantinople asserts the same. He says, you are expelled from the communion of the universal Catholic Church. I mean, that sounds like pretty important. The Pope could say that you're expelled. It also states that the authority of our see has decreed that no one is to be considered either deprived or excommunicated. That's on page 153. So how are we to interpret these statements? The same letter that its sentence states that its sentence must agree, is that one must agree with, is that it was held by the Roman See and Alexandria and the Universal Catholic Church. All right, so we also see the same thing stated in the letter of Celestine to John of Antioch, Jude of Jerusalem, Rufus of Thessalonica, Flavian of Philippi. You can see this in page 155. Now, this implies that Celestine was taken upon himself to speak on behalf of the church, right, of Rome, Alexandria, Universal Catholic Church, but not for the whole church. There's, I think, a difference in emphasis there. This is verified by how Cyril describes Celestine's actions, right? It's not my opinion. What St. Cyril saying in his letter to the Constantinopolitan clergy, he speaks of Nestorius being excommunicate by all, as we see in page 172. Page 159, letter of Cyril to John of Antioch. The Holy Council of Rome issued a decree excommunicating Nestorius, and indeed wrote to your piety, John of Antioch, the instructions that must be followed by those who wish to remain in communion with all the West. For we ourselves, Alexandria Synod, shall follow his judgment, fearing to lose the communion of so many. And that's at page 159. The Council of Ephesus, by the way, makes the same clarification, that Celestine was speaking for the Western Synod, not for the whole church. For example, the letter to Theodosius II, after the June 22nd session, we can read this on page 355, and this was written before the Roman legates arrived, states as thus, our verdict against Nestorius was ratified by all the West. All right? You can also see similar language in the report that Theodosius II sent via the envoys to the council on page 553. So the proceeding obviously refers not to the legates' participation, they weren't there, but their understanding that the Pope's earlier decree spoke for the Roman Synod specifically. So this must mean it did not speak for the whole church. When the Roman legates did arrive, in response to a reading from Celestine's letter on July 10th, I'm quoting page 374, Firmus, Bishop of Caesarea, said, there was a previous Roman verdict. We put the decree in effect. Okay? So hence, according to Ephesus, Celestine, and Cyril understood Rome's actions to be local in nature. The council literally effected the excommunication of Nestorius, not Celestine. Now, Celestine's excommunication was not treated as final because Nestorius was tried as a bishop during Ephesus, and it was not binding until the council issued a judgment. You can see this is the June 22nd session, page 231, page 232, 250, 254, and 281. Now, Rome consents to this. You can see this in letter of Celestine to Cyril on page 203. Nevertheless, the rhetorical advance in how the papacy's actions are described, right, that you're expelled from the church, will have an effect on future understanding. We got to keep that in the back of our mind. Now, how did the Council of Ephesus understand ecclesiology? St. Theodosius the Younger, in his letter of convocation, wrote, this is, I left out the page number, I'll have to give it to you later. Before the Most Holy Council, the decree that is going to issue by common vote, no fresh step obviously is be individually taken by anyone. So again, individually taken by anyone, no fresh step, no one can do anything. It demonstrates a lack of awareness that the Pope, or anyone for that matter, can function independently of an ecumenical council. In his letter to Cyril, Theodosius warns, and this is page 199, for from old these doctrines of piety have been defined for us not by threats of someone domineering, but by the deliberation of the Holy Fathers in the sacred council, not through imperiousness, but consent. Again, the ecclesiology of consent is explicit in the historical sources, and his concern is over Alexandrine domineering, not Roman, as the former see had more perceived importance. It'll come up in Chalcedon, by the way. Others invoked the ecclesiology of consent. So Chalcedon, for example, said, "Let us, as is beneficial, be of one mind and one conviction. Let the whole assembly in common join us. We are confident that this," Rome's deposition of Nestorius, "will receive the assent of your holinesses." So that's Chalcedon, pages 372, 373. Theodotus of Ancyra spoke of common decision and assent. And Caprolius of Carthage invoking the necessity of both the authority of the Apostolic See and a unanimous priestly vote. And we see both those in June 22nd session, page 277, 279. Now, the latter, that is Caprolius, speaks of the Holy Spirit being present in your hearts during the proceedings, repeating the language of conciliar infallibility that was invoked during Nicaea. And that's, you can read on page 279. The papacy is never described in such terms in either the 4th or 5th centuries. Only the council, because again, I said before, it comes from Nicaea, this idea that the consent of bishops is the evidence of the Holy Spirit's work. That is the charism, is in the consensus. There is a whole exchange between the Roman legates and the council where the former note Chalcedon's importance because they're angry that the council was held without him, while the latter affirmed the legitimate work of the council before the legates attended, demanding the legates' subscription. You could read that Theodotus and Ancyra in the council comments on pages 375 and 377. But honorifics aside, during this exchange, the legates do consent that the June 22nd session was conducted canonically. And you read this, the comments of Philip the Legate at page 376. And Projectus the Legate signed these proceedings, stating, "Putting into effect in every way the deposition of Nestorius." You see this at page 381. In summary, Celestine acted as Patriarch of the West and exhibited no jurisdiction over the entire church during Ephesus. Consistent with Pope Julius a century previously, as we covered in the last episode, Roman had the right to consent to the council, which is why their subscription in every way affected the deposition of Nestorius. The ecclesiology of consent is explicitly found in the sources surrounding this council. So those are my comments. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So, right around the year, 430-ish, down there, Pope Celestine I, a saint for both the Latins and the Greeks, receives this letter from Cyril of Alexandria. He's also a saint and doctor of the church for Latins and Greeks. And it's about the perverse doctrines of Nestorius, filling it in on what was happening. And he says, among other things, that the ancient custom of the churches persuades us to communicate these things to your holiness. I write, again, of necessity. Now, custom, that's an interesting word because it's the word that Pope Julius had used when he rehabilitated Athanasius. Remember, St. Athanasius has been condemned at that clown show, I believe the Synod of Tyre. And within his apology, he has the letter from Pope Julius canceling this sentence, saying, "Do you not know that it's the custom to write to us, so that what is just may be decreed from here?" So, custom has a certain significance here. Okay? But beyond that, the Pope held a synod. He very quickly condemned the doctrines of Nestorius, everything. He proclaimed that the Blessed Virgin should and must be called the Theotokos, meaning she has given birth to a person who is God and man. So she's the mother of God. And he condemns this idea that there are somehow two sons of God, whether it's two persons, two hypostases. All of that is condemned. Okay, we don't have to get into the precise issue of what it was exactly that Nestorius taught. I'm sure that's going to be debated, to no end. The scholars love to do that sort of thing. Okay. Pope Celestine says this to Cyril after condemning all these errors. He says, "Having assumed unto yourself the authority of our see, and using our stead and our place with authority, you shall execute this sentence with the utmost strictness. That is, unless within 10 days, to be counted from when he received this admonition, he condemns his perverse doctrines in a written confession, and confirms affirms that he holds the same faith about the birth of Christ our God as the Roman Church and the Church of Your Holiness and the universal devotion hold, Your Holiness will promptly provide for that church. PL 5463. And of course, the Pope writes similar things to the other bishops, John of Antioch, Papal Vicar Rufus of Thessalonica, Juvenal of Jerusalem, and so on. Flavian of Philippi, who's the Metropolitan of Macedonia. And he's telling them the same thing. Sentence has been passed against Nestorius by us, or rather by Christ our God. And he reiterates, unless Nestorius retracted his heresy within 10 days, he would be outside of the body of bishops. And that's exactly what the Pope wrote to Nestorius. Know openly that this is our sentence. Unless you preach what the Roman and Alexandrian and the universal Catholic Church hold concerning Christ our God, within 10 days when you hear of this, know that you have been cast out of the universal Catholic Church. Now, I remind you of what he said to Cyril, to St. Cyril. He uses the future indicative. You shall execute this sentence with the utmost strictness. Now, you may not notice that, but I did. You know who uses the future indicative? Your boss, the IRS, the police.
The CDC.
Those type of people get to use the future indicative. Maybe your wife sometimes as well. I shouldn't get into that.
My wife
Anyhow,
does.
of course, we know... We know that, of course, Theodosius II, the emperor, decided to call an ecumenical council. I think everybody pretty much knows that. So a lot of time went by beyond that 10 days that he talks about. But St. Cyril wrote to Rome. And, he said, well, what about this? Should Nestorius be admitted as a member of the council or had the sentence taken effect already? Now, the Pope replied to this on May 7, 431, shortly before the council. And basically what he says is that God doesn't want the death of the sinner. What the Pope wanted, what God wants, is to try to bring Nestorius back to the truth. And that was what St. Cyril was to try to do, if possible. But nobody had really thought of an ecumenical council or anything like that at the time this letter had, this sentence had been passed. So, of course, we know that there is the controversy with John of Antioch because he arrived there late. St. Cyril thought he was, trying to block the process against Nestorius. John holds a rival council, condemns Cyril. I think, students of church history know all of that. The council, though, the true council under St. Cyril, very quickly condemned Nestorius, actually using the words urged of necessity, in Greek, anankaios katepekthentes. I use the ancient pronunciation I was taught, the Attic. I don't know how to pronounce modern Greek, actually. But anankaios katepekthentes, that is, urged necessarily by the sacred canons and by the letter of our most holy Father and fellow minister, Celestin. With Bishop of the Roman Church, with tears, we have necessarily come to this sorrowful sentence against him. Shortly afterwards, the Roman legates arrive, and they ask that these decrees all be read out to them again. And the priest Philip, a legate of Rome, makes this pronouncement, which I think is quite famous. He says, "It is doubtful to no one, indeed it is known to all ages, that the Holy and Most Blessed Peter, Prince and Head of the Apostles, pillar of the faith and foundation of the Catholic Church, received the keys of the kingdom from our Lord Jesus Christ, Savior and Redeemer of the human race. That to him was given the power of binding and loosing sins, who up to this very age ever lives and judges in his successors accordingly. Our holy and most blessed Father, Bishop Celestin, his successor in order, who also holds his place, has sent us to this holy synod, supplying for his own presence." And he continues with his approval of the sentence against Nestorius. So what happens? Well, the other legates speak in exactly the same vein, and then St. Cyril speaks, and he says, the depositions given by the most holy and God-beloved bishops Arcadius and Projectus as legates by the pious priest Philip have been made manifest to the synod. They have deposed as filling the place of the apostolic see and the bishops of the entire Western Synod. Since they have executed what had already been laid down by the most holy and God-beloved Bishop Celestin, have concurred with the sentence pronounced against the heretic Nestorius by the Holy Synod, gathered in this metropolis of Ephesus, let the actions of yesterday and today be joined to the preceding acts and offered to their piety, so that they, in the customary manner, may, by their own signature, make manifest their canonical agreement with all of us. Mancy 4, 1299. Now, we should remember the context here. Celestin had entrusted his place to Cyril in this council. That's clearly also noted in the Acts. He even considered Cyril the man to execute a sentence that had already been passed at Rome. It sent his legates there with instructions to take counsel with Cyril and to take counsel in all things with Cyril and to act in concert with him. That's the context we should remember behind all of these acts. Now, of course, John of Antioch has a synod of maybe 60 bishops or so, and he presumes to communicate the legitimate synod, which had more than 3 times the number of bishops. And more bishops came over to the legitimate synod. John didn't really have the power to do these things. He went up to the emperor, as Father Price, the great translator, tell us, the ecumenical councils are imperial councils. So, to get the emperor's approval for his council, what does St. Cyril do? Good old-fashioned bribery, according to history. Lots and lots of gold paid out and other gifts, all in the good cause of defending the holy rights and dignity of the Mother of God. He eventually reaches a formula of union with John of Antioch, which I think is based on his second epistle to Nestorius. I don't think we need to get into the other things here. We're discussing issues that are illustrative of the Pope's position in the church. So with that, I'll just go ahead and turn it back.
Well, John, guess what? We're going to be back with you, and you could talk about the councils of Ephesus, too, and Chalcedon, and the role of papacy in those councils.
Oh, okay, so I'm starting again.
You start again.
Okay, fine. All right. So, So we start with the heretic Eutyches, who believes himself a faithful disciple of St. Cyril, who refused to believe in 2 natures after the union. He was condemned by his own Bishop Flavian of Constantinople. This resulted in his appeals. He appealed all over. He appealed wherever he could. He appealed to a very holy bishop named St. Peter Chrysologus, who, according to tradition, was chosen as bishop by a miracle of St. Peter the Apostle, a miraculous vision. St. Peter Chrysologus warned him to listen to the blessed bishop of the city of Rome, because Peter, who lives and judges in his successors, provides the truth to those who ask for it. And St. Peter Chrysologus denied that he had any power to hear appeals involving faith, matters of faith, without the consent of the Bishop of Rome. By the way, that's what holy men do sometimes. They say, I don't have power to do this. I don't have jurisdiction. It's always nice to hear that. Okay, this results in St. Leo writing the famous letter 28 to Flavian, known as the Tome. The result is an ecumenical council, or what was supposed to be one, at Ephesus, supposed to be the Second Council of Ephesus, with Dioscorus of Alexandria presiding. We know that it rehabilitated the heretic Eutyches. This resulted in multiple appeals to Rome. First of all, Flavian himself said, I appeal. The Father Price translation has him saying that to the Roman legate, I appeal to you. What I found in the Greek is that he said to Dioscurus, I appeal from you, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. The text of his appeal was recovered in the 19th century and published by Mommsen and others, Palazzo Flaviani, where he appeals to the apostolic see of Peter the Coryphaeus and the synod under him, meaning under the blessed Pope. We have the appeal from Eusebius of Dorylaeum, another hero of Orthodoxy, an opponent of both Nestorianism and Eutychianism. Eusebius asked for letters from the Pope bestowing on him his rank and communion. That appeal was rediscovered together with the appeal of Flavian. And Theodoret. Now, Theodoret had some problems because he was considered a friend of Nestorius. He's under some suspicion. Now, Theodoret appealed to Rome as well, basically asking Pope Leo to order him, Theodoret, to appear at Rome, and thus to hear that case. And he says, I await the sentence of your apostolic see. I beg and urge your holiness, to whose just tribunal I appeal to help me, to order me to go and give an account of my doctrine. PG 83, 13, 13 to 13, 16. In his letter to the legate of Rome, the priest Renatus, he actually says that Rome has hegemonia over the churches throughout the world for several reasons. PG 83, 13, 24. The appeals even come from the imperial family. In other words, the relatives of Theodosius who would approve this disastrous Second Synod of Ephesus. So basically, Valentinian, the Western emperor, writes to Theodosius, reminding him that antiquity conferred the principality of the priesthood overall to the most blessed Bishop of Rome, that he had the faculty of judging with regard to the faith and the bishops. PL 54, 859. There's that word I've used before, principatus, the principality. The principatus, that's not an honorific. That's a word that indicates the highest level of authority. Same with Galla Placidia, who was the mother, I believe she's the mother of Valentinian. She also she wrote to Theodosius as well, reminding him that it wasn't Rome where St. Peter, who received the keys of the kingdom of heaven, held the principality of the priesthood. Sacerdotii principatum tenuit. Again, the word principality, the principatus, associated both with St. Peter and his Roman episcopate and with the Bishop of Rome, his successor. So, of course, those appeals were lost on Theodosius, but he died a few months later in an accident on his horse. I think he fell off his horse. And so St. Pulcheria comes in, becomes the ruler. She marries I believe, a general, Marcian. And Marcian promises Pope Leo that there's going to be a real council. It's going to be no nonsense. There's going to be a council this time following the ecclesiastical rules. The word he actually says the synod will be celebrated, I'll give the Latin words, te auctore. Literally, that means having you as its author. That's Marcian to St. Leo, PL 54, 899. Okay, so what St. Leo does is he treats the bishops who took part in this clown show at Ephesus, he treats them as being lapsed. And he sends his legates into the east, basically to rehabilitate or to forgive them, to restore them. And in most cases, they would do that by signing the tome to Flavian, and that was enough. If there were more serious offenses they'd committed, that would be reserved to Rome. Luckily, Anatolius was a priest under Dioscorus who had been representing him at Constantinople, became the bishop, and Anatolius very wisely decided to sign the tome of Leo, and thus he entered into communion with Rome, and this is all approved by Pope Leo as well. And that was a very big deal, that change that took place with Anatolius. Pope Leo would have preferred the council to take place in Italy. All historians know that. But he did not resist the judgment. He called it the devout judgment of Marcion, who decided for, I believe, first Nicaea, and then he changed it to Chalcedon nearby. Now, council meets in, I believe, October 8th, 451. And Pope Leo has sent his legates out. One of them is a bishop named Pascasinus. And what does he see when he walks in? Dioscorus is with the judges. He says, no, we're not doing that. So what he says is, we have in our hands orders from the most blessed and apostolic Pope of the city of Rome, which is head of all the churches, by which his apostleship has deigned to command that Dioscorus is not to sit in the council. It is necessary for us to observe this. Either he is to go out or we leave. Now, the commissioners want to know, well, what is the specific problem? What's your specific accusation? Another legate, Lucentius, says, it is necessary that he give an account for his judgment, because, although it was not his place to act as judge, he presumed and dared to make a synod without the authority of the apostolic see, which was never lawful and never done. Now, we were told that St. Meletius had presided over an ecumenical council out of Roman communion. The legates have never heard of any such thing. It's serious offense to them, and it's not St. Meletius they're accusing of it, it's Dioscorus. Dioscorus did it, okay? Nobody's accusing St. Meletius of doing anything like that. So what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is that the other bishops injured were allowed to come in as accusers, and Dioscorus moved to the position of the accused. So Theodoret comes in with his accusation. Eusebius of Dorylaeum comes in. But there's another thing that happens. And there's no explanation that I find in the Acts. But 5 days later is the third session. And instead of the commissioners who are presiding, it's the Roman legate, Pascasinus. And he pronounces sentence on Dioscorus, right? 5 days after the beginning of the council, third session. Because Dioscorus, presuming the primacy for himself, received in communion Eutyches, a man with opinions similar to his own. With regard to the bishops at Ephesus, the legate Pascasinus says this, referring to them, to the latter indeed the apostolic see has granted pardon for what was done by them there against their will, to those who have continued up to the present in obedience to the most holy Archbishop Leo and to the entire holy and universal council. He has received them into his communion as his fellow faithful. But not Dioscorus. Dioscorus, of course, continued unrepentant, ignored 3 summonses, and so he concludes this long discourse with this sentence. Therefore, the most holy and most blessed Archbishop of Great and Old Rome, Leo, through us and through the present Holy Synod, together with the thrice blessed Apostle Peter, worthy of all praise, was the rock and foundation of the Catholic Church and the foundation of the Orthodox faith, has stripped him both of the dignity of the episcopate and of all priestly ministry. Now, the bishops follow, beginning with Anatolius. Saint Anatolius indicates his agreement with this sentence. The other bishops follow, indicating their agreement with the legates or with Anatolius or both. Back to you.
All right. So I'm just adjusting the mic volume, and now I'll start Councils Ephesus and Chalcedon. Traditionally, Rome was always more important than Alexandria. Officially, as the Edict of Thessalonica delineates, both Rome and Alexandria faithfully represented the divine witness of the Apostle Peter. Considering Alexandria's influence in the Councils of Nicaea, Constantinople I, and then Ephesus, it's going to sound crazy, but we have to think of someone at the time. One could begin to perceive an Alexandrine primacy to someone living in the mid-5th century. It may even appear there was a Roman primacy according to honor, but an Alexandrine primacy according to reality. People debate over the significance of honorifics, but consider some of Alexandria's at this period. Pope Dioscorus of Alexandria is called ecumenical archbishop during the Second Synod of Ephesus. You can read this in the open source translation, page 287. The archbishop and great guardian of the faith, you can read that on page 155. A personage unique in the world, on page 127. We see Pope Theodosius of Alexandria a century later being called, and I'm quoting Jacob Baradite, the schismatic, in the letter of the anti-Chalcedonian bishops to the faithful and conflict bishop, and this is in the book Faithful Conflict and Negotiating Early Church, page 158. He calls the Pope Alexandria the head of the bishops. So, as we can see, there are these same titles which you'd see for Rome being given to Alexandria. Now, Ephesus II deposed Flavian Constantinople, and Ephesus II openly defied Pope Leo, and Dioscorus went as far as excommunicate Leo afterwards. Leo, of course, reciprocated. Politically, Chalcedon was revenge against Alexandria for what they did at Ephesus II, and Rome, understandably, tag teamed with Constantinople, both of them which were humbled during Ephesus II. Now, this political backdrop is necessary in order to understand how the Pope is described in his role during the council. The legates use honorifics such as Rome, head of the churches. You can see this in Volume 1 of Price and Gaddis Chalcedon, page 129. And they call them the Apostolic See. Just so you know, this is something that Juvenal during the Council of Ephesus also calls Jerusalem. Now, Chalcedon refers to Leo as the head, and they call themselves the children. We can see this in Leo's letter 98, paragraph 4. Head of all the churches, to me then, has a specific meaning in the East, and I glean this from manuscript differences, all right? So there's a section in the council, and you can read this in Volume 2, page 70, where the papal legates in the Latin section will refer to the Holy Most Blessed Pope, the head of the universal church, endowed as he is, the dignity of the Peter the Apostle, who was called the foundation, the rock, etc. But the more numerous Greek witnesses are rendered as follows. The most holy and blessed Leo, Archbishop of Great and Senior Rome, through us, the legates, in the present most holy council, through the thrice blessed and holy renowned Peter the Apostle, who is the rock, etc. So as we can see, the Latin portrays the Pope as head of the church endowed with a charism from Christ. The latter lacks the title Pope or reference to the headship of the church and speaks of Leo through the council pronouncing sentence with Peter. Affirming the 5th century rendering of both traditions, which I think we could do, this requires us to understand that head of the universal church, as seen in the Latin, was not understood to pertain to superiority, but something the Pope attained to through conciliarity. And the reason why this is the case, because the Greek was what was actually read. And so the Latin honorific went too far for their liking, and so how it's re-rendered in the Greek obviously shows what they wanted people to actually understand. That's why it's so important. Now, when people go, well, that sounds like gobbledygook, how could being the head of something be attained to through conciliarity? Well, as a simple example, a husband is the unquestioned head of a family. But if the husband walks out on the family's still the family, right? It's not like the husband is the family in isolation. The family is the family. And the husband loses his headship that he had early attained by unity with the family, right? And so essentially that's actually a very cogent idea of understanding exactly what's being said. So what was read was likely what was meant to be conveyed, otherwise why else read it? Now concerning references to Peter, we see this come up sometimes when the Pope or the legate is called Peter, and this is something that implies a charism. Well, we see that Peter of Corinth is called Saint Peter when he leaves the side of Dioscorus, and this shows this is just a simple compliment. And you can read this in session 1. It's in volume 1, page 188. Now, Antioch is also, by the way, identified as the see of St. Peter. You see this in volume 2, page 247. So I only point this out because people will see these honorifics about Rome, but they tend to not see the same honorifics when they're applied to other people. People should just know it does happen. Now, appeals surrounding Chalcedon. This is very important. Flavian appealed to Rome, specifically during Ephesus 2. And you could read the section Ephesus 2 in volume 1, page 34. The legate Hilary famously replied, contradictor, which I'm sure John would do a better job pronouncing. This does not mean he instantly undid Ephesus 2 by virtue of papal powers, because it sounds like contradict, right? So people think, well, that's what it means. But Chalcedon records this as it means. I'm quoting Chalcedon on the same page. An objection is lodged. So all Hilary is saying, I note that you have lodged an objection. Now, evidently, this was understood to mean another, more fair ecumenical council will take up the case. How do we know this? Well, Theodoret appealed to Leo to hold an ecumenical council, as we read in Theodoret's appeal to Leo, paragraph 8, which he describes as, quotes, an united synod of the fathers both of West and East, right? So not the Pope in isolation. Now, due to the uncanonical nature of Theodoret's deposition in Ephesus 2, as well as Leo's restoration on the basis of its lack of canonicity, this led to the latter being treated as a bishop, right? So Theodoret's treated as a bishop. But even then, he was retried at Chalcedon. This indicates that Leo's restoration was not the highest authority. Just like in Ephesus, Celestine's excommunication of Nestorius was not the highest authority. Only Chalcedon or Ephesus are the highest authority. Only Chalcedon could undo Ephesus 2. Now, Leo's excommunication, Dioscorus, and others also was not the final say. Chalcedon was. This is very interesting. So Pope Leo concedes this in letter 95, paragraph 4. He states, I modified my practice. They whom I excommunicated still retain their sees and their ranks as bishops. We see the same thing in letter 34, paragraph 1, where Leo made the excommunication of Eutyches contingent upon if he perseveres in his perversity. So just note that beforehand, Eutyches had appealed to Rome, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Thessalonica, as we can see in page 264, volume 1. So it shows that not only was the judgment not absolutely final, it shows that you can make appeals to all over the place, not just to Rome. Now, in Leo's own sentence, that's how Leo describes it, against Dioscorus and Eutyches to the Council of Chalcedon, look how he refers to both of them. So he has a sentence against them, but how does he refer to them? Volume 2, page 69. He refers to Dioscorus as Bishop of the city of Alexandria. He retains his title. But how does he identify Eutyches? Not by his clergyman title, but without it, because he says he had been lawfully condemned by his own bishop. So evidently, Leo's decisions were not binding in an interpatriarchal context. Only an ecumenical councils was. Eutyches' condemnation was intra-patriarchal and thereby binding and canonical. Even the Roman legates requested the council, I'm quoting the legates, page 70 of the same book, to pronounce as justice bids a canonical verdict against the aforesaid Dioscorus. This means the final sentence against Dioscorus would have not been canonical apart from the council. This is not eisegesis, as Leo himself had already interpreted the Sardican canons to apply to the work of an ecumenical council, not simply an appeal to Rome alone. You can read that in letter 43, paragraph 3 of Leo's letters. Now, concerning events during Chalcedon, debate broke out over Ephesus 2, not reading Leo's letter. This is in volume 1, pages 148 to 150. Now, I'm going to bring this up because it actually kind of helps John's case. But many people think that, the church really didn't have to listen to Rome at all. And that's like a Protestant heresy. That has nothing to do with Orthodoxy. Now, why is this the case? Why does pages 148 to 150 demonstrate this for us? Well, Dioscorus and Juvenal were called to task. They were called to task for not reading Leo's tome. And they didn't defend themselves saying, we didn't have to do that. Leo's tome's not important. They didn't say that. Rather, Dioscorus said that he tried to, and the latter says that the letter of the emperors distracted him. So in short, this demonstrates that Rome's cooperation with the ecumenical council is necessary. They have not gave some such lame excuses if Rome's input wasn't absolutely essential. Now, the papal legates make clear that they cannot, I'm quoting them, go against the instructions of the Pope, nor against the ecclesiastical canons or traditions of the fathers. Now, we see in Leo's letter, and that's page 130, same book, Leo in letter 117, paragraph 1, affirmed his assent to what the Synod had passed concerning the faith, but rejected Canon 28 on the absolute authority of the Nicene canons. Why do I bring both these up? Rome's prerogatives were seen as canonical in their origin. This was originally an honor, right? Like, why wouldn't that be an honor? But Rome would later reject this in later centuries in a bid for extra canonical authority, for that where it comes solely from Christ. Now, it also shows that Rome began equating its own decrees with local canonical force. People don't understand this because they don't read enough history, but Canon 1 of the Synod of Rome in 465 says papal decrees are canons. And so you'll see in Western collections of canon law, you'll see canons and ecumenical council canons, but you also see papal decrees side by side. Because in Western canon law, both are canonical. That comes from the Council of Rome 465. Be aware of this. Now, Chalcedon was not a coronation ceremony for Leo's tome. Bishops had to give their assent and even debated the tome, including Illyrian bishops within Rome's own jurisdiction. When Rome objected to Chalcedon's first draft definition, you can read this in volume 2, page 200, the Illyrians called the Roman legates Nestorians. So now in closing, Chalcedon evidences the existence of consensus-based ecclesiology, with Rome's role relegated to cooperating with the council and exercising a spiritual headship. This emphasis makes sense given Alexander's attempt to usurp this headship. That's the whole political, what's it called? Whatever. That's the whole political thing that's going on there. Now, being that John went first and then I went second, now I will start with the Acacian Schism and Alexander's 497 letter to Rome, and then John will go after me. So the Acacian Schism. When the Western Roman Empire fell apart, Constantinople's pro-Roman policy, like we saw, Chalcedon went away. It was seen as more prudent to end religious conflicts within the remaining Roman Empire. What was within another empire now was deemed as less important. This required, regrettably, capitulation to the Miaphysites with the allowance that Chalcedon was still in the books in Constantinople, and they wanted this so they could retain Canon 28. Now, this occurred during Acacius Constantinople's bishopric, hence the Acacian Schism. At the same time, Rome was under Ostrogothic domination, and they had adopted an anti-Byzantine policy. Surprise, surprise. Now, Pope Gelasius, in the letter Theodoric, the Ostrogoth, which is dismissive of the canons of the East. And so, right, this makes sense. This is now in a different empire, so he's dismissive of that other empire's canons. And he writes that the canons of Sardica ordered that appeals from the whole church should be deferred to the examination of this see, that's Rome. And by this it should judge the whole church, while it should come itself before no man's judgment. I'm quoting this letter from Denny, Papalism, pages 399 to 401. Now, papal prerogatives, again, in that statement, were seen as canonical in their origin. One should note that this is a novel interpretation of Sardica, by the way, because when Pope Leo interpreted Sardica, he said it referred to an ecumenical council, not that Rome is the judge and they judge the whole church. So just keep that in mind. Additionally, we must take note that in Augustine's letter 43, he believed that Rome could be appealed to, as we referred to earlier. So this perhaps is an advance. It certainly isn't rhetoric, but it doesn't necessarily mean Gelasius rejected that any single patriarch, that no one could appeal Rome in an ecumenical council. Maybe it's just talking about single patriarchates judging them. I actually don't think that's the case, but it's something that we have to keep in mind. The rhetoric is clearly a theological advance, given the geopolitical and theological situation now that Rome is a different empire from Constantinople. Now, in the East, there are both Miaphysite and Diaphysite partisans in communion with one another. People forget this. I think it's just two sides, but they're actually kind of interlapped. It appears that this included tangential communion with Rome at certain periods, as Rome was in communion with Thessalonica, and the latter was in communion with Eastern Church, being part of the Byzantine Empire at this point. Now, for example, Andrew of Thessalonica re-entered communion with Pope Anastasius II between 497 and 498, due to the embassy of Photinus at Thessalonica, but other Western bishops rejected Photinus. Now, Photinus was then sent to Alexandria to try to broker a peace over Leo's tome, alleging the tome in Latin was consistent with Miaphysitism. This is absolutely heretical. But maybe it's not so much if we keep in mind that Alexandria wrote a letter to Rome trying to effect union on the basis of receiving a Miaphysite explanation of the tome, and because before Severus, like we see these things anachronistically, before Severus, Miaphysite Christology was not necessarily Severian. There's a lot to this. We can't cover this now. It has to do with Dioscorus being Eutychian, but the Henoticon not being Eutychian, etc. But Miaphysite Christology was not necessarily Severian at this time, and it could be plausibly reconciled with the tome. However, the schismatics was acceptable because it held that Chalcedon in the Greek was heretical, which is clearly not the case. They still want to reject Chalcedon simply to save face. During this time, Pope Anastasius II wrote to Emperor Anastasius explicitly recognizing the holy orders of Acacius. This becomes more of an issue later with Pope Hormisdas. Now, just so people are aware, Pope Anastasius II had a lofty view of the emperor, saying, I'm going to quote Anastasius II, Epistle 1, you could read this in the Latin in Thiel, page 620. The breast of your clemency, the Byzantine emperor, is the sanctuary of the public, so that through your insistence, God has ordered you to govern the world as his vicar. Right? He's calling the Roman emperor God's vicar. This is a similar honorific that Gelasius was called. He was called the Vicar of Christ in the Council of Rome 495. We can see this in Papalism, page 401 by Denny. But the point is, it's an honorific for both these individuals. This desire to maintain communion with Constantinople led to the dispute between Laurentius and Symmachus in the subsequent century, with communion with the former pope and his synod enduring until approximately 507. So about 30% of the entire Acacian Schism actually had intercommunion with the Miaphysites. So that kind of gets left out a lot. So anyway, that's my notes on the Acacian Schism in the 5th century. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, the Council of Chalcedon succeeded in defining the Orthodox faith, but unfortunately did not actually unite the heretics with the true church. And so there was a revolt in Palestine, also in Egypt, where the Orthodox Proterius was actually murdered. So the emperors, some of them tried to, modify their tactics a little bit, make some adjustments. One of these adjustments was known as the Henoticon, an attempted decree of union of the churches. Now, what it says is that we accept no other faith or even definition of faith besides Nicaea, but they do include the first 3 councils and provisions of these councils, as well as the 12 chapters of St. Cyril, which was very acceptable to the Miaphysites, of course. And then says, if anybody thinks anything else, whether at Chalcedon or anyone else, let him be anathema. Now, when you put it that way, not only is that, as the scholastics say, favoring heresy, favens heresy, as they say, to say we accept no other definition of faith suggests the exclusion of Chalcedon, which is savoring of heresy, as, again, the scholastics say, sapiens heresin. And the outright denial of Chalcedon actually is heresy. So, what happens? Well, the notorious heresiarchs are, in fact, installed into the sees of Antioch and Alexandria during this general period. We don't have to go into all the details, but the most infamous ones were both, the 2 worst ones are named Peter Mongus of Alexandria, Peter the Fuller of Antioch. Peter the Fuller is associated with that change in the Trisagion prayer, where they added some words to it that make it cease to be a Trinitarian prayer. So you see problems with ecumenism and messing in the liturgy didn't begin with the Vatican II modernists or with Cranmer. So Rome gets wind of this and figures out that Acacius, the Constantinopolitan patriarch, is behind this. It's a sophisticated document. Also, Rome has allies and informants. One of them is John Collorafi, an Orthodox bishop who had been cast out of Alexandria. He appealed to Rome, according to the chroniclers. Also, the monks who were known as the Sleepless of Constantinople, because they prayed constantly in 3 different shifts. Now, by 484, it didn't take long. Rome held a council, and the Pope, Felix III, condemned, he anathematized Acacius. Now, this sentence was brought to him, and it was pinned to his vestments by a sleepless monk as the patriarch was about to celebrate the Divine Liturgy. We have that from the chronicler Liberatus. I love that detail. The sentence begins this. This is the beginning. Not a lot of pleasantries here. Begins, quote, "You are found guilty of many transgressions, and having often acted in contempt of the Venerable Council of Nicaea, you have temerariously usurped the rights of other provinces. Purveyors of heresy and men ordained by heretics, whom you yourself had condemned, and whose condemnation you obtained from the Apostolic See, you not only saw fit to receive into your communion, but further, to the exclusion of others, you made them preside as bishops, which you could not have done even if they had been Catholics." Now, that didn't go over too well with the emperor and the patriarch, obviously. So the result is a 35-year schism known as the Acacian Schism. It ends with the formula Pope Hormisdas, which we're going to talk about next time. Now, during this schism, obviously the popes defended their right to do all these things. That's not really a man bites dog story. That's what one would accept. For example, you've mentioned Pope Gelasius, Saint Gelasius in the 490s. You mentioned one of his letters. I have a very similar letter from him in Theos Romanorum Pontificum Epistolae, 395. "We will not pass over in silence what every church throughout the world knows, that the see of the blessed Apostle Peter has the right to absolve from what has been bound by the sentence of any prelates whatsoever, and that it has the right of judging of the whole church. Neither is it lawful for anyone to pass judgment on its judgment. The canons of will that deals with may be made in any part of the world, but that from it nobody be permitted to appeal." Now, again, that's not a surprise. It's what we would expect. So I'd like to instead focus on a couple of things that people really are not taught that they should. During this time, the popes referred to the Catholic Church as the communion of Blessed Peter. And we find this in lesser fathers as well. For example, the life of Saint Fulgentius. Young Fulgentius wants to be a monk. He wanted to go into the Thebaid, the Egyptian desert. But of course, this was a hotbed of heresy. And in his travels, he meets a holy bishop, Eulalius of Syracuse, and finding out what the monk was going to do, Eulalius, the bishop, gives a warning. "The lands to which you want to proceed have been separated from the communion of Blessed Peter by an unbelieving dissension. Return, my son, lest in your quest for a better life, your right faith is endangered." PL 65, 129. And notice, by the way, I didn't hear any of the jargon or palaver of the modern ecumenists. I didn't hear about Oriental Orthodox or any of that. He says, an unbelieving dissension. The lands to which you want to proceed have been separated from the communion of Blessed Peter by an unbelieving dissension. That's my feeling. I mean, don't give heresy a dignity it doesn't deserve. Lest I digress. Anyway, I'd like to read an appeal, this one, not from the Orthodox, but from those who were condemned by Rome. These are bishops who were, it's called the Eastern Church to Symmachus, Bishop of Rome. Nancy 8, 221 begins. I want to read this because you don't really get a chance too often to get a perspective from those who were condemned. What would they say about Rome's authority and what right it had to do what it did? Well, let's see. They're writing to Pope Symmachus. It's around 500 or so. They're under duress, basically. They're in communion with either Acacius or men condemned by Rome, because it's the emperor's will, pretty much. This is what they write to the Pope. "O Father, full of tenderness for your children, says it is not in a vision but in reality. With your mind's eyes you see us perishing by the prevarication of our father Acacius. Do not delay. Do not sleep, but hasten to help us. You have received not only the power to bind, but also to loose, after the Master's example, those who have long been in chains. Not only the power to tear down and destroy, but also that of building and planting like Jeremiah, or rather like Jesus Christ, of whom Jeremiah was the figure. Not only the power to deliver up to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, but also that of bringing back to life through charity those who have long been rejected. You whom Peter, your sacred teacher, teaches every day to feed, not by violence, but by a well-accepted authority, Christ's sheep entrusted to you throughout the world. We urge you then to tear up this new decree that weighs over us, as Jesus Christ, our Savior, but also our head, tore up the old one on the cross. If Acacius was anathematized because of his friendship for the Alexandrians, or rather for the Eutychians, who anathematized Leo in the Council of Chalcedon, why are we considered heretics and put under anathema? We who are attached only to the letter of Leo, which is read out of the council, we who are attacked each day and condemned as heretics by the Eutychians because we preach your Orthodox teaching. Do not disdain to help us. Do not despise us because we are in communion with our enemies. Among those who only had the care of a small number of souls, many have separated themselves from their communion. Others, placed over a smaller flock, have given way to necessity, so as not to abandon the sheep to the wolf like the hireling. All of us, both those who appear to be in communion with the adversaries and those who abstain from it, await after God the light of your visitation and assistance." So that's how men wrote, bishops and priests wrote, under condemnation from Rome. Because under duress, they had embraced the communion that they should not. And of course, there wasn't really a lot Rome could do for them. What they were doing was wrong, and their only defense here is not that they were doing the right thing, but only that they were acting under duress. Well, that's not really good enough, and the Pope kind of let them know that in a nice way. So I thought that was interesting. That's from Nancy 8, 221 and following. Okay, so that's what I try to do, is that we try to give you sources that you're not typically going to hear anywhere else. I think I've delivered once again tonight. So Craig, with that, I'll just put it back to you. Go ahead.
Well, John, how about you summarize your thoughts on the 5th century? I'll then give my summary and we'll do some plugs.
I'm going to waive that because I think I'm going to let the sources speak for themselves. I'm going to use the words of Pope Hormisdas. These things which have been said are proven by the events. Hecque dicta sunt rerum probantur effectibus. So if you're looking, you're trying to discern, to learn, I've given you, in the words of the fathers, ample means of discernment, and I'm willing to give more. So I'll turn it back to you, Craig.
All right, thank you, John. I'm just going to just turn down my audio a little bit so I'm not too loud. 1 second. And I will never say no to more time. So I will do a brief closing statement. And I think what's clear in this episode, compared to all the previous centuries we just did, that there's been major rhetorical advances in how the papacy was described. major rhetorical advances. Here are my top 5 popes. Pope Zosimus, quote him, "Our authority is such that nobody may review our sentence." Number 2, Pope Boniface. "So it is clear that this church, Rome, is to all churches throughout the world as a head to its members, that whosoever separates from it becomes an exile from the Christian religion, since he ceases to belong to its fellowship." That's Epistle 14 to the bishops of Thessaly. You can find that quoted in Giles' Documents Illustrating Papal Authority, page 230. Celestine writes, "You are expelled from the community of the Universal Catholic Church." And he writes elsewhere, "The authority of our see has decreed that no one is to be considered deprived or excommunicated." We see, and that was, by the way, for those that Nestorius excommunicated. He says, well, no, we overturn it. Then we have the legates speaking about Leo. They call Rome the head of all the churches. I mean, that's a pretty clear title. And then we see Gelasius say Rome should calm itself before no man's judgment. Now, the first 3 papal statements, though strongly worded, of course, are in reference to local disputes or judgments. So, in my honest opinion, historically, they're not really important for our purposes here for trying to find out the papacy of today, whether it has these historical origins. But the last 2 quotes are actually relevant when it comes to Vatican I papacy claims. For the former, about Leo's legates, the same honorific as we just talked about was ascribed to Alexandria, and it appears to be in reference to Rome's role in being a necessary partner in an ecumenical council. Not that they are above such a council. So I bring this up because that's what we unpacked in the sources, but when you just hear in isolation, Rome, head of all the churches, people jump to conclusions that are anachronistic with how that same sentence would have been explained. Now, for the latter, we see Gelasius did not explicitly repudiate the role of the ecumenical council's judge as a final judge in all matters. And so I think Gelasius' statement comes much closer to what we see to be a development of the actual sort of papacy that we know about today. Now, the way the events of the century transpired vindicate this analysis. The councils of Carthage, Ephesus, and Chalcedon all explicitly presumed upon a consensus-based ecclesiology. And so I'd actually prefer to read Gelasius in a charitable way that he's consistent with what we see in the rest of the century, even if rhetorically he's much more advanced and the political situation called for much more, like when people in an argument, they speak much more extremely. So right now that East and West are in different sides on an issue, these statements get much more extreme. Now, the resistance to the Carthaginian and the Illyrian synods within Roman jurisdiction itself also validates the consensus-based ecclesiology on the intra-patriarchal level. It wasn't just inter-patriarchal. We see in Canon 34, the Apostolic Canons, is true between the patriarchates and within the patriarchates. Now, not surprisingly, St. Vincent de Lérens during the century explains the church's epistemology exactly along consensus-based lines. Commentary in paragraph 6 says, "The rule we shall observe if we follow universality, antiquity, and consent." Again, consensus-based ecclesiology and epistemology. Nevertheless, by the end of the 5th century, Rome was no longer part of the Roman Empire. While part of the empire, Pope Leo said to the emperor that no error can delude you. We see that in letters 162-3. I like to call that the emperor infallibility passage. And shortly afterwards, we see Anastasius II called emperor God's vicar. But as time went on and Rome was reincorporated by force into the Roman Empire, these fond honorifics disappeared as Rome was de facto treated as an occupied territory and junior partner during the Byzantine papacy. As we shall see, this, thanks to evolving rhetoric and even some forgeries, led to the reinvention of the papacy as an institution from a linchpin and a consensus-based model to a fundamentally independent and superior ecclesiastical institution. That's why I need to take time in this conclusion to bring this out, because people hear this rhetorical advance. Now, during the Acacian Schism, we start seeing the first real changes, and it really coincides with now Rome's no longer in the same empire. Now, the former ecclesiology that's a consensus-based is something we delineated from the 1st century, while the latter, I believe, is a demonstrable historical innovation. It was a geopolitical necessity given Rome's location and its jurisdiction crossing national lines. Their own jurisdiction wasn't just in the Roman Empire, so they had to worry about Visigothic Spain, and they had to worry about the Franks in France, and they had to worry about the Greeks in Illyricum. and they had to worry about the Lombards in Italy. So they had to now have under their care people under multiple different empires, not just one. So ironically, the next century, the 6th century, we're going to find will prove to be the nadir of papal authority. The very opposite of what we're talking about, as they were under the thumb of Roman occupiers in that time and not developed a muscular ecclesiology of independence and superiority in response to their subjugation. And so I think what we need to keep our eyes on as this series unfolds is with the development of independent papal ecclesiology, the papacy enters a collision course with the original consensus-based ecclesiology of the church, what we still saw existing in all the ecumenical councils in the 5th century. So that being said, John, I'm done, and let me give you an opportunity to do some plugs.
Well, the only plug I have is for the fathers of the church we talked about tonight. If you're discerning the truth, if you no longer believe in sola scriptura, you want to find the true church of the ancients, pray to them, and if you make the resolve that by God's grace, not even wild horses are going to keep you from the truth, they will help you.
Yeah, so we have to read the scripture according to the saints. We have to understand church history, what the church is according to the saints, the doctrines according to the saints. And that's why I'm going to recommend, John, Don't Get Angry, your book, which I quoted several times in my own presentations. John's book, Keys of the Christian World, he wrote with Scott Butler, is a very good resource because it has so many primary sources, like from Thiel, that are still just in Latin, stuff translated to English for you. And so that's why it's very important that you take advantage of this resource. You could get it on the Robert Segenis website. So you could Google Robert Segenis website and you could find that and you could purchase this book. It's a really, really good resource. For example, I just spent $44 on 7th century hagiographies on Pope St. Martin. And for less money, I think it is, you could have 650 pages on tons of popes, thanks to John Collorafi's book. So I really think that's a book people should check out, Keys Over the Christian World. John has just been for us a wealth of knowledge, and I think that book is just a really good resource people should take advantage of. So because of that, John, I just want to give my sincere gratitude. I won't give any more compliments because I know they annoy you. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, you're welcome, and as I said, I think I said before, you understand magnanimity is not the enemy of truth, and I commend you for that. So.
Well, thank you, John. And with that said, I will end the show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus Sirach, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.